this as I can. It's not every day you open up for tablet magazines courtesy Arden. I will also say AA has challenged everyone that if you can't name everyone that's at the bottom of this slide, you have to get out, I believe the phrase is. It is very much a truism to suggest that praxis or action is a force which can bring about societal change. But that change itself is at its most feasible and takes hold most effectively when society itself has received prior conditioning to the oncoming changes. The most powerful form of conditioning is propaganda. It's so powerful in the mass age that the perception of society we are given represents almost nothing recognisable to those who have to exist within it. This is of course no accident. For as long as there has been any semblance of large-scale organisation amongst peoples, there has always been a minority within that performs the role of organising said people. As organisations have grown larger and more complex, there has been a need to better manage the perception of the organised. So a scientific approach to perception management was developed to answer this need. The birth of public relations, as envisioned by Edward Bernays in the early 20th century, is held as the first attempt really to consciously develop this science, despite the dismissal from contemporary scholars at the time as mere hokum. Hence why, for the majority of this talk, I shall draw on a later work from Jacques Ellul carrying the same name as Bernays, Propaganda, within which he gives careful treatment to propaganda as the technical synthesis of psychological and organisational influence upon the masses. Similar to James Burnham, who Ellul was more than familiar with, he writes in a cold and very frank fashion, one that at times could be confused for almost an admiration of the complexity and power of the subject they had chosen to study. Fantastic. Many observers look upon propaganda as a collection of gimmicks and of more or less serious practices, and psychologists and sociologists very often reject the scientific character of these practices. For our part, we completely agree that propaganda is a technique rather than a science. But it is a modern technique, that is, it is based on one or more branches of science. Propaganda is the expression of these branches of science. It moves with them, shares in their successes, and bears witness to their failures. Today we find no end to the list of institutions dedicated to public relations, nudge units, polling organisations, human resources, interest groups and think tanks, to name just a few. Not to mention a media network that gives free rein to each of these institutions. To expressly distribute and present their propaganda to the public en masse, to measure, manufacture and manage the required perception. Public perception, its management, and more recently its manufacturing, has been a subject of focus for many great thinkers, and has been shown time and time again to be an integral component of any powerful organisation. This is a lesson we must go on to apply to ourselves if we wish for any political success in the future, but more on that later. One could argue, and I believe it to be true, that 9/10 of power is all perception at the end of the day, and even more so in our day. I do not seek to make a concrete case for this here, as much as it would be interesting to do so. I hope instead, through a brief investigation of propaganda in the mass age, that this conclusion may begin to reveal itself. First, we must begin with an overview of the relation between power and perception. This will allow us to see what drives the need for the development and distribution of propaganda. Ludwig von Mises in Human Action provides a good starting point for this with his conception of mind. As a rule, one says only of a man or of groups of men that they are mighty. Then the definition of might is the power to direct other people's actions. He who is mighty owes his might to an ideology. Only ideologies can convey to a man the power to influence other people's choices and conduct. Might is thus not a physical and tangible thing, but a moral and spiritual phenomenon. He who uses his might to run the state, i.e. the social apparatus of coercion and compulsion, rules. Rule is the exercise of might in the political body. Mises also notes, a durable system of government must rest upon an ideology acknowledged by the majority. This is a recognition that for organisational power to manifest as lasting and effective, it must at least be perceived as mighty. This, of course, does not remain limited to the exercise of physical might, and requires some form of psychological influence that legitimises the ruler amongst those that are organised. This influence takes many forms, but the general concept reflects that which Gaetano Mosca in his work The Ruling Class calls a political formula. In fairly populous societies that attained a certain level of civilization, ruling classes do not justify their power exclusively by de facto possession of it, but try to find a moral and legal basis for it, representing it as the logical and necessary consequence of doctrines and beliefs that are generally recognised and accepted. In a sense, these tangible political formulas are the physical expression of this concept of might from Mises. Be that in the form of a constitution, a tradition of divine right of kings, or the progressive rhetoric of equality and diversity. Each one acts as a central pole rulers can orientate the populace, other non-ruling elites, and enemies of the ruling class around. Both thinkers wrote at a time when the Industrial Revolution was more than a century into its stride, but the information age was still much in its infancy. This might in part explain why both Mises and Mosca reflected on either the majoritarian support or a moral unity between the rulers and the ruled. They could not have foreseen the extent to which public opinion could not only be swayed, but completely manufactured, using all the arms of the technocratic state that would develop in short order. There was a small number of thinkers at this time who questioned the legitimacy of public opinion. However, this line of questioning was, and still is in its early stages. The time has passed when propaganda was a matter of individual inspiration, personal subtlety, or the use of unsophisticated tricks. Now science has entered propaganda. The emerging powers from roughly 1900 onwards developed both mental and physical techniques for the conscious organisation of the growing uniform mass. This is the inner essence of all managerialism, as we shall see later, and possibly the most accurate description of propaganda's true aim, the very creation of the mass itself. This was not only made feasible by the development of communication technologies which helped to accelerate the massification of society. No longer was political conditioning limited to the scope of rational arguments delivered by statesmen in an effort to honestly convince some portion of the populace towards formal political action of one form or another. Instead, we find that the rulers, or soon-to-be rulers in many cases, would rather just show and tell us what they wish to bring to fruition in more subtle and yet ever more intrusive ways, until the populace arrives at the positions said rulers conditioned them for, needing only to ask for permission. The rulers, of course, will gladly oblige, even begrudgingly for the sake of keeping up appearances, and instilling a sentiment within those who have been conditioned that they were the originators of change. And with change being an also important aspect of propaganda's goals within society, it is worth delving into what changed across the 19th and 20th century that allowed the entering of science into propaganda, and brought about the wider reaching and more effective results in the pre-industrial age could have ever provided. Enter the revolution of mass and scale, as described by Sam Francis in his magnum opus Leviathan and its Enemies. Sorry, this is a bit of a long one, but it's worth it. In the last half of the 19th century, and the first part of the 20th, Western Europe and North America experienced a profound and unique transformation in the dominant structures of their common civilization. This transformation, comparable in its implications to those of the Neolithic transformation from subsistence hunting to agricultural production, is not yet complete, and will probably not end soon. Its essential characteristic consists in the vast and dramatic enlargement of mass and scale in almost all areas of organised human activity. The growth of mass populations, concentrated in huge urban conglomerations, working in large factories and offices, producing, consuming, governing, voting, communicating, and fighting on scales and in numbers that are unique in history. The principal consequence of this revolution of mass and scale has been the reorganisation of human communities at all levels into structures radically different from the institutions of earlier civilizations. These new structures, mass organisations, today are the dominant, though not still the most common form of social organisation in the Western world, and government in the form of bureaucratised mass states, whether constitutional or totalitarian, and the economy in the form of mass corporations, public agencies, and unions that direct and regulate production and consumption in society, in the form of mass churches and religious movements, mass universities and educational institutions, mass media and mass associations that contain and discipline the population. This phenomenon requires the utter disposal and destruction of what Francis referred to as bourgeois institutions, the last remnants left over from times before the democratic revolutions across the West. This was needed to drive both the functional and ideological centralisation of society itself, as nothing was left in the wake to pick up the pieces other than the emerging managerial elites. This sense of gutting Western civilization across the 19th and 20th century is a common reactionary theme, and has been touched on by more thinkers than I care to mention here. The best of these thinkers, however, admittedly decades prior to Francis, recognised that this gutting allowed for the replacing of the old world with something new. In the same way that a living body stays alive only when a soul is present to govern it, so every social organisation not rooted in a spiritual reality is outward and transitory, unable to remain healthy and retain its identity in the struggle of the various forces. It is not really an organism, but more aptly something thrown together, an aggregate. The true cause for the decline in the political idea in the West today is to be found in the fact that the spiritual values that once permeated the social order have been lost, without any successful efforts to put something better in their place. Stripping society of all of its bourgeois institutions had a twofold effect. It excused and facilitated the emergence of the managerial elite on one hand. On the other, it brought about the death of organic and spiritually connected organisations, leaving the newly industrialised masses with nothing that resembled the old world. They were both spiritually and materially disconnected from all that came before, perfectly deracinated and primed for what was to come next. Jacques goes to great lengths to identify this two-pronged effect as the perfect preconditioning for uniform mass organisation, and for the installation of as many doctrines, techniques and ideas as the new elites require to harness the necessary might, as Mises framed it, for rapid and continuous social change. The most favourable moment to seize a man and influence him is when he is alone in the mass. It is this point that propaganda can be most effective. Illud extends this further with his concept of the lonely crowd. It is a product of social isolation and exposure to mass organisation techniques, which attempt to place the individual as a lone actor, and yet as one that is still part of the masses. It is able to approach you and all the other yous all the same. This leads the individual to become conscious of his position amongst the social mass, which can only assume to be engaging in the same consumptive process as himself, being imbued with the same messaging. Illud takes this idea further by introducing the concept of the organised or the small group. If by chance propaganda is addressed to an organised group, it can have practically no effect on individuals before that group has been fragmented. Such fragmentation can be achieved through action, but it is equally possible to fragment a group by psychological means. I think that very heavily relates back to the team from Panama's Hats speak earlier on of infectious logos. This transformation of very small groups by purely psychological means is one of the most important techniques of propaganda. Only when very small groups are thus annihilated, when the individual finds no more defences, no equilibrium, no resistance exercised by the group to which he belongs, does total action by propaganda become possible. Those small groups, the owner-entrepreneur businesses, church and schooling communities, and guilds, to name a few, represent exactly what Francis would refer to as bourgeois. They were the victims both of the mass labour mobilisation instigated by the Industrial Revolution and the progressive assaults later laid upon them in an effort to totalise society by the methods of propaganda. The bourgeois institutions and the elites who operate them are still present today, but no longer in their previous form. Nor do they play the role of being the various power centres that they once were. Only the fringes of society come in contact with these institutions. That's us. And with these fringes come little benefits, as the masses have almost none or possibly even a negative perception of the old bourgeois world. The mass instead dances around the maypole of mobilised, mechanised, and even digitised labour and consumption patterns. Each and every one of them waits for the next technical rhythm to learn, implement, and laud their fellow man, all of them becoming lost in the worker mass. To quote one of Austria's more middling mid-century painters, the broad mass is feminine. The mass exists in a negative form, and it must, just like the feminine, be activated by its antipode, the masculine, or in this case, the organising elite. Julius Evola allows us to further understand this interplay in an excerpt from the Metaphysics of Sex. The male is form, the female is matter. Form here means the power that determines and arouses the principle of motion, development, and becoming. Matter means the material and instrumental cause of all development. The pure indeterminate capability, the substance of power that, being devoid of form in itself, can take up any form, and which in itself is nothing but can become everything when it's awakened and fecundated. Elites, organisers, leaders, whichever you wish to call them, are the activating and directing component in social affairs. The masses are little else than passive and potential matter, willing, and in the modern age, desperate, to take on the form bestowed upon them from their prospective elites. This form is always one that is distributed through the techniques of propaganda, fecundating the mass psyche with necessary triggers, instructions, and targets. Even ideology, that once great political force, has to be superseded by technical necessity and the striving for proficiency that is required to rule over an ever-expanding and uniform mass. The bigger the mass, and the higher the intensity of uniformism is required, the more and more ideology must be warped to suit, leading to what we recognise now as the global homogenised culture of prescribed ideology. The two supposed ideological poles of capitalism and socialism, both birthed by the revolution of massive scale, mind you, are reduced to little else than rhetorical and symbolic stylings when one grasps the similarity in the development of mass organisation techniques done in their name. One must keep in mind that propaganda must concentrate on the densest mass. It must be organised for the enormous mass of individuals. The great majority is not found among the very rich or the very poor. Propaganda is made for those who have attained an average standard of living. Both capitalism and socialism, as prospective ideologies, targeted, developed, and coordinated exactly this aggregate and dense mass. Each had their base materialist roots when diluted to the level of public messaging, and consequently revolve around getting the masses develop and follow along similar technical lines. Freedom through consumption and freedom through production differ little as techniques of mass organisation. Despite all the bluster in that period about liberal ideology and socialist polemics, I would argue that the most competent of the early 20th century rulers were neither. They were purely technical operators, or managerialists as has been referred to already, and their most pressing task was to reconcile any remaining antagonism existing between the dense mass and their growing position as industrialised and mechanised labourers. The industrial slave looks down on his agricultural brother serf vegetating among his pigs and crops. To be anchored to a plot of land like a tree is much the same thing as being tied for life to a machine, only the former is healthier. This is not how most people regard it. To be anchored amongst people is to be anchored amongst people is their true heart's desire. To share their life and responsibility. To be a blind, dependent, obedient cell of a crowd organism. The rulers of nations of a more capitalist styling, such as the United States at the time, sought to contract out to the likes of Edward Bernays, who throughout a considerable portion of his work sold the myth that to consume products themselves was the highest act of freedom. Even went to the lengths of marketing cigarettes to women under the guise that the consumption could be a collective act of, an act of collective liberation. A thing we are much more common with nowadays, as we are inundated with capitalist and cultural activist messaging that is blended into one. The continuous push of messages of this ilk was a central force in driving the public to accept the conditions of wage labour in newly constructed metropolises. The new freedoms granted to them by the industrialists and political leaders justified their strife, or so they were told. But this was enough to get the ball rolling. For it is always important to remember that the best propaganda plays upon pre-existing sentiments within man. The want for freedom is a sentiment found in almost every person. Whether or not they are capable of action, it could guarantee it. Hence, when they are told that being free is now easy as buying a new Chevrolet or smoking Marlboros, they can be incredibly receptive to such a message. Doubly so when it carries on for decades, culminating in the strongest image we have of post-war American age. The new house in the suburbs, the white picket fence, 2 cars in the driveway, and your favourite flavour of white household goods. The symbol of a society that has been perfectly, psychologically and physically conditioned into its new conditions. This is par for the course to a character like Bernays, who cut his teeth engaging in what he called psychological warfare on the behalf of the US government during World War I. His objective was to sell the public of Latin American nations a positive image of newly arriving US organisations that needed resources and manpower for the war effort. Bernays first operated on a populace of individuals that was lost in a war mass, and from this he saw what could be done for a nation at war could be done for organisations and people in a nation at peace. Another pioneer of mass organisation, who unlike Bernays was not only a propagandist, but the very ruler the masses looked up to, was Vladimir Lenin. This is a difference we'll come across again later, and maybe one which our elites today are attempting to resolve. There seems to be a pattern that forms when one looks at how propaganda techniques have developed across the world. Until very recently, in the more technically advanced nations, there was a tendency to hire out, contract to, or even completely cover up those that involved in the development and usage of propaganda techniques. Whereas in the less developed nations, as we should see with the examples of Bolshevik Russia and Mao's China, their leaders tend to be the very people who develop and make use of propaganda techniques. So too can they be found lauding these techniques over other nations as a measure of their greatness. Anyone remember the Cuban literacy rates? This may in fact be a direct result of the want to have the public perceive their own subjection to propaganda as something which strengthens them. One struggle. Be this a reflection of the greater inequality of technical skills present in these nations, or the greater number of opportunities available to manage and push for the construction of networks required to distribute propaganda, both lead to the rapid development of mass organisation techniques. This latter aspect of opportunities is one Lenin recognised deeply, as he saw the function of a national newspaper or national radio programme as a mechanism for organising, not just information distribution. Regardless of the content within, the collective reading of uniform materials brews a mass psychology in its most simple form. This is similar to what Oswald Spengler describes as the reader mass, an informed portion of the public waiting for the call to action. Unleash the people as reader mass, and it will storm through the streets and hurl itself upon the target indicated, terrifying and breaking windows, a hint to the press staff, and it will become quiet and go home. Lenin opted for a differing strategy to reconcile and condition the workers for their new environment. Adapting existing Marxist political formulas, the public, that dense and aggregate mass of the public, was inundated with messaging that told them if they struggled against the bourgeois classes in just the right fashion, that the very acts of production and labouring would free them, and furthermore, free man entirely from the strictures of the material world. This went a step further than the messaging of the likes of Bernays, who used wartime tactics with peacetime concepts. Lenin remained wholly in the wartime camp on both fronts, as he sought to agitate the now organised proletariat into enmity against other groups. This plays not only in the sentiment for freedom, but the arguably much stronger propensity of man to hate. It is obvious that propaganda must not concern itself with what is best in man. The highest goals humanity sets for itself, its noblest and most precious feelings. Propaganda does not aim to elevate man, but to make him serve. It must therefore utilise the most common feelings, and the most widespread ideas, the crudest patterns, and in doing so, place itself on a very low level with regard to what it wants man to do and to what end. Hate, hunger, and pride make better levers of propaganda than do love or impartiality. What if one wasn't just limited to the natural sentiments imbued in man, but instead could take hold of a mass at such a physical, civilizationally young age that its very character could be changed? This is what Mao attempted with his programs in pre-communist China, a nation so different in regards to propaganda from the West that a whole new perspective had to be developed, one that had a central focus on education. Mao recognised, much like modern propagandists now, that length and duration can drastically increase the effectiveness of propaganda. This is likely a consequence not of the pure theorising on Mao's part so much, but more a result of the greater inequality of general technical skills. Lenin dealt with the issues of how to popularise a newspaper and reconcile the differences of class in a somewhat industrialised nation. Mao, on the other hand, had to make sure the masses he wished to organise were literate, never mind reading the right newspaper. I love this image. It's I believe that the caption for it is something like, "This is how you draw the character, Daddy," or something. But this was a massive emphasis in all of Mao's propaganda. It was not just political education, but educating the kids so that they would then go forth to educate the adults in a language they hadn't ever been taught before. So instead you just teach the children, whatever language it is, just through the lens of Marxist-Leninism. And now all language in your nation becomes imbued with these sort of notions. There'll be more on this later. Political education was aimed less at agitation and rebellion and more at a slow and deep infusion of certain economic notions based on the widespread desire for land distribution. Mao's political education was a triumphant success, at least for him and his vanguard, because he took advantage of the lesser civilized nature of the Chinese populace and sought to civilize them through the teachings of Marxist-Leninism. To speak of Marxist literature in modern China is redundant, for the masses there know of no other kind of thinking. Mao's brilliance can also be seen through the way in which he imbued Marxist-Leninist thought with a much heavier agrarian tone, so that he could speak to the world that the average Chinese lived in at such a time. This effort was so successful that by the time of the Cultural Revolution, Mao had developed such a barbaric and uncompromising force of mass organisation that its eventual outburst into action in 1966, some 40 years after the original implementation of Mao's strategies, made Lenin's Red Terror of 1918 onwards pale in comparison. What little modernisation Mao had introduced was enough to convince the populace that the bourgeois powers are what held China back from the industrial and technical innovations of the West. If only they could be removed by some kind of great leap forward and replaced with the ideal communist man Mao had modelled the masses after. This ideal, and the striving to make each and every man fit into it, is the process that Mao referred to as moulding, and continued to play into his view of propaganda as taking place over great lengths of time, and subsuming all in its totality. When one builds a socialist society, every person must be placed in the mould, the exploiters as well as the workers. Who says that the working class does not need this? Naturally, moulding the exploiter and the worker are two different operations. We ourselves are being placed in the mould every year. I have gone through a remoulding of my own thoughts, and I must continue. Moulding the minds of men to suit conditions better and further to change the very conditions we live in is a universal goal of all effective propaganda. We no longer, however, use the aesthetics of Maoism. Instead, we adapt man to society in the name of progress in the pure abstract. This is the sort of pattern we see in the propagandist elites like Tony Blair, who made it one of his central goals in power to open up higher education to the masses, so that we now have an adult population of which nearly a third has received a university education, and we are so normalised to this extended period of moulding that we see no problem in no longer asking teenagers whether they will go to university. Instead, we ask them what they plan to study when they do go. But this still isn't enough for the Dark Lord. As recently as this year, he's claimed that 70% of all youths should attend a university. No longer do these elite institutions teach just a select few as they did even as early as the 1900s. One also cannot ignore that adding higher education to the expected education plans of young Britons puts them at 16 to 17 years of full-time education, a period in their life when they are told to sponge up as much technical and specialist knowledge as they can, having been fooled into picking their own flavour of specialised career poison. So too does this prolonged state of technical education come wrapped up in the context of the post-war consensus, or boomer truth regime to those who know. With a sprinkling on top of the necessary managerial influences, much like Mao's China, it is redundant to speak of a progressive British culture, for it is all the British people have known for decades. Thought you might enjoy that.
What's the caption for this one?
Not got there yet. I haven't thought of anything dark and insidious enough. I think of the sort of northern working class family sending their first child of generations to university, courtesy of the policies of that kind old Tony Blair, only for them to return home spouting nonsense about the racist nature of Western literature or something of that ilk. Why re-educate the entire mass when one can manufacture its replacement? There he is there, his little red tie on. New Labour, New Britain. Mass organisation is the sole task of the managerial elite. Not all of them see it like this, however. It is only the most elite in their own circles that view societal organisation with such technical necessity. They are consciously manufacturing public perception with the long-term goal of amassing power to enact their agenda. This is the driver of what many see as the Chinification of the West as we begin to be further adapted to a social credit score system. This, however, I think is much better understood as the further massification of Western societies as a whole. Much like Mao made use of both the inequalities of technical knowledge and the opportunities for construction, organisations like the World Economic Forum seem to have in their mind the mediation of all managerial nations. so that the organisational techniques can be further universalised across the globe. It is worth noting here that the WEF, the EU Commission, countless other very evil organisations, and many others have pushed blockchain development in the West as a cryptographic backbone to link all the non-centralised big data systems from social media, banks and security forces, to store cards, GPS location services and home smart meters. Each attribute, a term familiar to those who have studied the UK government's digital identity framework, is to be culminated into the one system, a social and climate credit score system. One which the CCP, China, was happy to produce off their own back, likely to handle the continuing rapid massification of their society. Let us also not forget that much of the work carried out to develop blockchain systems was done in the name of venture capitalism and private interests, and was initially marketed to those with free market libertarian values. The silicon chips would literally set them free. It is likely that this has been in the works for years as Western nations have become more and more data-driven. The real question of intrigue will be whether or not these systems are slipped in through the back door, or will Westerners be brought up to speed and made to feel pride in their subjugation. Again, we see that despite the set-dressing capitalist or socialist ideology, the necessity of organising and massifying a society drives innovation, not ideas. We can see this necessity on a higher level too, as organisations like the WEF embark on projects under the guise of the public-private partnership, which on the face of it seeks many simple corporatist and progressive goals. However, I would argue that this partnership is little else than a mask for the process of collaborating, organising, and creating greater uniformity in propaganda and its techniques to further condition all the people to act as the one digital mass. This can only be achieved by propagandising the propagandists and organising the organisers in our very own nations. Massification breeds centralisation, both in organisational structure and in messaging. This is why the global mass must be a digital mass. It is the simplest and yet most intrusive way to make the populace act as a singular technical hive mind. It is then no surprise that this coincides with a higher intensity of explicitly global political formulas, whereby climate change, COVID, and many other social ills, as least we are told, can only be tackled by global organisation first and foremost. Let us not forget that these global solutions have been in development for years, and possibly decades prior to 2020, being drip-fed into the public psyche until we beg for them. Not only are national leaders directly incentivised to organise from above, they are also pressured by a populace below, inundated with the very same messaging to play ball. Russia's cancellation and separation from international finance was a warning to any and all nations that wish to disentangle themselves from mass global organisation and reject its messaging. There may not be a formal organisation that we can yet recognise, but it's clear that there is a global perception management machine at work. This can only mean one thing, that some form of global power is emerging and that even sovereign states may be powerless against it. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. And if they can do it, then why can't we? As Wyndham Lewis notes, the organisation of suggestion and the power of education are so perfect today that nothing, given a little time, is impossible. If our goal, as has been discussed both at prior shapings and Nomos events, is to form a vanguard, then we must first consider ourselves a propaganda organisation. This is also not to mention the effect that being part of our own small group has on our ability to resist both psychological and organisational propaganda. There is a claim that has been targeted at many of us in our sphere on numerous occasions that we do indeed function like propagandists. One example was the alternative influencer network. I don't know if everyone will be able to see that, but you can see the rough kind of network thing, and there's some old names in there, isn't there? How things have changed. A study by Rebecca Lewis in 2018 She goes to great lengths to explain network effects on social media, and in particular on YouTube, which is demonstrated by this graphic, which is hilariously outdated but will still work for our purposes. Much of this study is basic intuition to even those passively engaged in distant content. However, things have also come a long way since 2019 in terms of YouTube policy in regards to Lewis's complaints, which some of us know all too much about. Instead, I would rather focus on what is almost entirely omitted from the study. There is loose reference to individual influencers collaborating with one another, or some of their ties with other outlying media organisations. She is aware of people functioning like singular propagandists, but at no point does there come the claim that these influencers these influencers themselves were organised as a whole. And in a very simple sense, it's a case of, well, this wasn't real and formalised, but why shouldn't we make it so? This too has changed since 2018. As we continue to build communities both online and more importantly off, we have naturally developed a loose organisational structure. The tightening of such a structure, the making of a network like the one pictured here, into a robust propaganda organisation with the conscious intent of spreading our ideas in as many varying forms as possible, this is the way forward for our vanguard. Even in the dismal age that ours is, where propaganda is so total that the line between it and reality is blurred, there are still opportunities to be found. Over the years, we have and will continue to develop the elite skills required to produce online content. The masses may be online, but they are not savvy. They will always be present to consume content from producers. Now, whilst we can't compete with Netflix, we can indeed compete with many of the older legacy media organisations as they try to further transition into online media, reaching onto turf we can fight them on. We must also consider how massified man is today. He must be lost to some degree, or he must be lost to some degree first for propaganda to fully take hold. What if we were to take hold of him first? It may seem idealistic, but I would happily put myself forward as an example of this, and not in the way you're thinking. I would never have written this speech, read the source material required, or known anyone in this sphere had it not been for the content I consumed in my more formative years. By no means is this a suggestion that everyone consuming dissident content online is going to become part of any organised group. What it does show is that the differing levels of content can be used as a method to bring resourceful people out of the mass and into the small group. In any case, it is understood that because of this specialisation, not one of these instruments may be left out. They may all be used in combination. The propagandist uses a keyboard and composes a symphony. Neither can we forget that the mass man can be found through every type of content that exists. Our propaganda organisation will require musicians, poets, novelists, intellectuals, artists, meme technicians, and so much more. There are more than enough roles to fill to suit the wide skill set we have accrued amongst us. So the sooner we get on to it, the better, because we need you.